Redeemer. Amen. They say that you can tell a lot about a culture from what its tallest buildings are. You know, generally what we find most valuable, we build up the highest so that it's the easiest to see. Once upon a time, the tallest buildings in the world were family homes. It was all you really had. They were the first buildings built, so they were the biggest. In later times and in later cultures, we had this sort of battle, whether it was going to be military installations or government facilities, including royal palaces, and houses of worship. And they would duel for the tallest building title. In various parts of the world and various times, those were all the tallest. One of them would be the one casting the imposing shadow over the towns where people lived. And today, in every major city in the world, every large city, in every culture, what takes up our highest spaces is always business. Always. Money talks, after all, and it elevates itself above all our other concerns. We live in a time in history in which families, governments, militaries, and religions are all subject to the whims of money. After all, money's what makes the world go round, as people are fond of saying. So there's a huge sermon about idolatry in there somewhere, but today that's not what we're going to talk about. Instead, I would ask you to accept my premise that what we put up high tells us something about who we are. Think about it in relation to our stories today. So, I read to you from the book of Numbers, this odd little story about a bronze serpent up on a pole. This is one of those stories I remember in college as an undergrad studying religion. We read about this story, and a lot of people born and raised in the church, attended every Sunday, had never heard this story before. So feel no guilt if you don't know this one. This story about poisonous snakes. It's such an odd one. It's buried in the book of Numbers where we almost never look. Most preachers avoid it, and I'm not really going to preach on it today either, but I think it's important to understand our John reading, to understand this passage from Numbers. So I think it merits some explanation before we move on. As you probably know, there was this time when the Israelites were slaves to Pharaoh in Egypt. And Moses helped lead them out of their time of slavery and to the promised land of Israel. The journey, though not a long one in miles, took them 40 years as they would, set up camp for a while, then move along, slowly but surely. And the story that we read today takes place in one of those times when the Israelites have settled and they're not yet in the promised land, but no longer in Egypt. And on the trip, this trip which has been long and difficult and honestly boring, the Israelites begin to complain. Now, I don't want to be too critical of that complaining, because I think any of us would complain. This week, I think it was Monday, the furnace went out in our house. It was not fun. So we got cold, and I got up in the morning and looked, and it was way down to 60 degrees at its coldest point. And I was sitting there working on my sermon this week and thinking, that's not that cold. Really, all things considered. I was complaining because it was so cold. But, when people moved to South Dakota 130 years ago, they had it colder in their homes than 60 degrees on the day that we had a blizzard. So it's very easy to take what you have for granted. And I think the Israelites did that same thing. They had stuff, but they started to complain, because that's what we do. Beyond that, I think the Israelites also forgot what things were like before. And this is also something we all do. The Israelites suggest, at least the food was good in Egypt. Out of the same sort of logic that any of us can use to return to an earlier time in our lives. Sometimes, yes, earlier times were better, but most of the time, when we think back to an earlier time, we idealize it. We idealize the things about it that we miss, and we ignore the things about it that were worse. And that is another thing I think we have in common with the Israelites here. If they had given it a moment's thought, they probably could have thought, yes, the food was good, But of course, we had no days off, and we didn't control our own lives. We were slaves. We were frequently beaten to death. It wasn't that good, actually. Sure, the food was better, but the rest of it wasn't worth having. But in a moment when what you're sick of right now is the food, it's easy to want to go back. I could deal with the rest of it for just a good meal. So that's when we get to the trickiest part of this passage, is once we understand the mindset of the Israelites, right? Things are okay, they're not great, and they're complaining. So in the book of Numbers, what the passage tells us is, the Lord sent poisonous serpents among the people, and they bit the people, so many Israelites died. Now I'm going to be honest, when I hear that passage, when I read that this week, I think, God is petty and childish. Some people complain, so you kill them? That seems a little bit of an overreaction. It's one of those situations where I think, from my personal interpretation, we have to acknowledge that the writers of Scripture were more often concerned with explaining everything than they were with being consistent about their portrayal of God. So, in order to explain a plague of snakes, they say, well, God must have done it. It's a clean and easy answer. But unfortunately, I don't think that works for me. It doesn't sound like the God that I have come to know. I don't know God to punish everyone every time we complain about something. So I prefer to think of this as something that happened and a writer decided to explain away, but your mileage may vary on that. Regardless, the situation comes that there are poisonous snakes around. They start biting people and people start dying. So the Israelites ask Moses for guidance and for prayer. And so Moses prays to God. And this is part of the story that makes me really not understand how it could have been God sending those poisonous snakes earlier. Because God in this passage is the one who offers deliverance. The God that I know is the God who offers deliverance, not the one who's looking to get us in trouble. So Moses' prayer is answered. God tells Moses to build the highest thing in the camp, a bronze snake to put on a pole, which will heal anyone miraculously who looks at it. Just as we have in our cultures throughout history, the most important thing in that moment is elevated. And in that moment, the most important thing is the promise of deliverance from God. The healing for people who are desperately in need of it. So hopefully that clears some of that passage up if you weren't familiar with it. If you didn't know the story before, you do now. And it is relevant because our reading from John's Gospel, that includes that famous passage of John 3:16. Before that, it has that line, and just as Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness, so must the Son of Man be lifted up. It's a really odd reference to go back to, isn't it? Of all the stories in the Bible that John could have chosen to write about. And let's keep in mind, this is in a part of John's Gospel where he's not quoting from someone. This is just John writing. And he goes back and says, this reminds me of that story, when that serpent was lifted up in the wilderness. There are some commonalities there with the story of Jesus, though. The serpent was lifted up so that everyone could see it. Likewise, when the Romans crucified people, part of the point was to have them high up on display so that people could see the execution. So they lifted Jesus and any of their crucifixion victims up. The serpent was on a pole. Jesus was on a cross. That's something elevated, something to stick in the ground and lift up. The serpent was a direct result of fleeing a foreign power who wanted to control the Israelites. Jesus was executed by a foreign power who was controlling the Israelites. And finally, and most importantly of all, this serpent on that bronze pole and Jesus up on that cross were both a means of salvation. Yes, the serpent was a means of salvation from physical illness in this case. And when we are struggling with physical illness, it's very, very tempting to wish for a serpent of our own, something to just look at and be made well. When we're ill and while we walk this earth in our bodies, it's pretty easy to think of our physical health as being the most important thing in the world. But really, John's gospel includes this reference to the story from Numbers because it is, again, a story about what is most important, being raised up highest. It was easy for the Israelites to think, just as we often do, that their physical health was the most important thing, and that's what gets put up high. But the story of Jesus reveals a different truth to us. Now, of course, we are in the season of Lent, which is this season of a long journey to the cross. It's a metaphorical journey we make as we attempt to think our way through what Jesus is doing in the season of Lent. He knows that he has to prepare himself for his death and resurrection, so we must prepare ourselves too. Many people do so with prayer and with fasting, depriving our bodies to focus our spiritual lives. But to what end? Why? That's when our passage comes in with those verses that we probably all already know. Those famous verses that people hold them up at sporting events so that people can describe Christianity in one brief word and 3 numbers. John 3:16. For God so loved the world that he gave his only Son, so that everyone who believes in him may not perish, but may have eternal life. And continuing in verse 17, indeed, God did not send the Son into the world to condemn the world, but that the world might be saved through him. Jesus is not a poisonous snake coming into our camp to bite us, to make us ill, and to kill us. But Jesus comes as the way out, the deliverance, the promise of hope. Jesus goes through his own trials that in many ways mirror what the Israelites experienced in this desert wilderness snake scenario. We're told in these most famous of words from Scripture that God loved the entire world so much that we who believe would be given the keys to everlasting life. That's where I think we see the similarities to the snake. We see lifting up of the thing that will save us. In the case of the Israelites, we saw a snake lifted up to save the Israelites from snakes. In this case, Christ is lifted up to save us from ourselves. That's why Jesus is different than a snake. The promise of Jesus is not temporary relief from the pains of life, but a permanent home of life everlasting. The promise to enjoy the fruits of heaven with the Creator of the universe. It is the great hope in the promise of this passage that Jesus has come to save not once, not briefly, but always. That last part is so crucial to me. Verse 17 is so often omitted from readings of this passage. Verse 16 is the one verse sort of quick description of Christianity. But Jesus did not come here as a means to condemn us, but came here as the means of our salvation. See, we don't need someone to condemn us because our own actions condemn us all the time. Our thoughts, our actions, and the things we do so often are proof of our own depravity, are proof of our own weakness. It would be easy for Jesus to be that condemnatory thing, for Jesus to be the measuring stick to see how we don't stack up, how we must be proof that we're worthless to God, how we should be discarded. And admittedly, there are a lot of Christian groups who are a lot more excited about God's judgment than God's deliverance. But that's not what John's Gospel has us concerned about today. Instead, Jesus is the proof that God loves us, that we will be saved in spite of who we are. In spite of us being unable to stack up, we are saved because we are the children of God and because God loves us so much. Jesus is the proof of that love, that God's primary concern is not harming us, but rather saving us from harm. Brothers and sisters, the life of faith is not an easy one, as the journey to the cross constantly shows us. In this season of the year, we're reminded that Jesus' faith doesn't waver, although he questions, although he is upset, and although there is pain, torture, and suffering because of who he is. His life of faith was not easy, and we can no more expect ours to be. But most importantly, we know that we have the option to look up and be saved from those poisonous snakes. When we look up, we look not to the buildings that tower over us, that show off extravagance of wealth and power, and promise us salvation through temporary things, but we can look up to the humility on display at the cross, to the power that God shows by coming in human flesh to show us that we are saved and to prove that we are loved. Brothers and sisters, we may not always have the option to look on something and instantly feel that gratification of healing. We may not. But God promises that what we are being given is not temporary relief, but what we're being given is eternal salvation. Amen. The next hymn this morning is number 264, In the Cross of